We're starting with macroeconomics from today. Macro means looking at the larger picture. This particular reading, which is I want you to put the heading in your notes. Aggregate output, prices and economic growth. Okay, so this reading has more or less focused around a number called GDP. Have you heard of it before? GDP is gross domestic product. So just to build perspective, first we'll have a look at the GDP of few countries. So I'm on the IMF website. They have a data service which we can use of, and you can yourself spend a lot of time on this. They have some very interesting statistics on their website. Yeah, I'm just doing all countries, so it allows you to select database based on number of countries or even the regional databases. And these are the metrics that you can use. There are a lot of these metrics. Right now we're just going to have a look at, let's have a look at GDP at current prices in US dollars. You'll understand later on what this means. Let me just fetch the data here. So now the currency is US dollars. Scale is billions, and then we have GDP at current prices. Okay, so the difference between a constant price and a current price is it captures the impact of inflation. Are you following what I'm trying to say here? So starting with the first, so this is given in alphabetical sequence. Afghanistan, the GDP is shown as about 20 billion. This is 2014 data. Okay, so not necessary that all the data is updated on this particular portal. In fact, there's a significant lag in the updation of data. Now let's look at India, and maybe you can also note this down quickly just to kind of build a perspective. Okay, so 2014 current price USD, write down India. 2014 USD GDP values at current prices. So India, which is 2 trillion or 2042 billion. 2042 billion. Okay, let's look at a few more. So let's look at Japan. Japan is about 4595 billion, correct? And today GDP has kind of become such important metric that almost every political party talks about the growth of GDP. So this is the size of the economy. Japan 4595. Let's look at the US. US 17393. 17393. Any other country you're keen on? China. So 10557. Let's also have a look at Mongolia. We have a Mongolian student in the class today. Mongolia, here it is, 12.196. Any other country you're interested in? Okay, Zimbabwe, 14.197. Should we have a look at Syria? Okay, they have Syria. Yeah. Maybe we'll have to wait for a few years. Anything else? Germany, we missed on Germany. Okay, Germany is 3885. All of this is 2014 data, actual, not predicted. Are we okay here? I'll share the link and then do whatever you want to do with this. But this is, so basically the idea is now we've started judging the importance of the country based on the size of GDP. And imagine the person who came up with this idea for the first time, he must have never thought that someday the number that he is trying to calculate is going to become the most important number in the world to determine which country is doing good. Okay, so let's look at a little bit about that person. Heard of him before? No? So I put in some little information about him on the slides here. So he came up with this idea in 1934, and see, this is very interesting. he specifically warned against using it as a measure of welfare. What does it mean? Uh-huh. Method of how happy people are. Yeah, fair enough. So, for example, some of the oil-rich countries, they might have larger GDP, including some of the South African countries. I mean, some of the African continent countries, but not necessary that the welfare or overall well-being in the economy is very high. Okay, so in his research paper, he specifically warned that it should not be used as a measure of welfare, but we see how often it gets used that way. Isn't it? We judge a country based on per capita GDP. So in 1971, he got the Nobel Award for this, for his empirically founded interpretation of economic growth, which has led to new and deeper insight about the social structure and process of development. This came from the Nobel Awards website. Alright, so let's get started now. So let's understand how GDP works. Now, look at this carefully. I'll give you a lot of time to write. So, heading in your notes is going to be learning outcome A and B. Now, first definition, don't write, just listen to me carefully. GDP is market value of all the final goods and services produced within a country during a certain time period. Now, each of the word in the definition is important. Number one, market value. So you might have produced some goods, let's say worth 50, but you sold them for 60. So what goes into GDP, 50 or 60? 60. The final price at which the goods are sold, those are captured in the GDP process. Second, it uses the word final, which means intermediate goods are not a part of your GDP. So if you have a work in progress, you've been manufacturing, you have a work in progress, that would not be considered as a part of GDP. Generally inventories are, but let me again simplify this. If you've sold raw material, that raw material being considered as a intermediate good, that should not be a part of GDP. Are we okay here? If you're let's say producing tires, and those tires would be used as a part of the car to be sold in future, then those sale of those tires should not be considered as a part of GDP, intermediate goods. Now, within a country, so how about Indian companies doing business in African continent? Okay, will that be considered as GDP? No. So GDP as a concept is tied to the territorial borders of a country. So whatever goods and services produced and sold within our Indian geography or physical boundaries, those would be considered as a part of GDP. Now, there are two ways proposed in your syllabus through which you can calculate GDP, either the expenditure approach or income approach. Okay, and the larger way to think of it is like this. Okay, so I have this flowchart is coming from CFA curriculum. Imagine these are households and we have businesses here. Okay. Now, these businesses have to pay these households because these are the guys who are either the owners of the company or they are employees of the company. So some or the other way, these businesses are going to make them a payoff, and that payoff might come in the form of salary, it might come in the form of interest, it might come in different variables, correct? It might come in the form of profits or dividends. And then these households in return will use that money on consumption. Are you following what I'm trying to say? So when you look at things from a very large perspective, what you would expect is that whatever money that people have received, that money will be put to use somewhere. Either it is consumed or it is put to use somewhere. So from very large perspective, the total of this side and the total of this side should be same. So these are your two separate approaches of calculation of GDP. One is expenditure approach, the other one is income approach. Definition here, GDP is calculated as total income earned by the households and businesses in a country during a time period. Expenditure, it is calculated as total amount spent on the goods and services produced in the country during a time period. And this expenditure approach, again, we handle it in two ways: sum of value added and value of final goods. So it works this way. Imagine you buy raw material of 20, then you do processing of 30, and then you charge a profit of, let's say, 50, and you sell it for 100. So if you take 100, you're just taking value of final output. If you're doing sum of value added, what you would say is that 20, 50 and 100. This is a cycle. First it was worth 20, then 50, then 100. So the value addition here would be, value addition before this was 20, this was 30, and this was 50. Same numbers here. Are you following what I'm trying to say? Should I repeat this again? There was a good which was sold for 100. Okay. So raw material of that good was 20. When it became work in progress, it became 100. And finished goods sellable was, this was 50, this was 100. So value addition at this stage was 20. Then at this stage value addition was 30. And at this stage value addition is 50. How much is total? 100. So either you take this or you take this, the total is going to be same. These are the two approaches: sum of value added or value of final output. Okay, so write this down quickly and then we'll have some more discussion. Imagine you want to figure out what is the value of goods and services which is added in a very small locality of our city. Just think of model colony as one area and you have to figure out the value of goods and services produced in this. It's an extremely complicated task, isn't it? So one way of doing it is that you can go to every individual and figure out what is his monthly or annual expenditure. But you will also have to figure out that not everything that a person earns, he spends. He might be saving something. He might also be paying some amount of taxes. So one way you do it is, you will say if people in this locality are earning 100 in total, where is that money going? Some of that is being used for consumption purpose. We call this as C here, consumption. So consumption could be, let's say, buying groceries could be consumption, or buying some services, buying movie tickets, that's a consumption. Some of that 100 might also be going in savings. Correct? So not necessary that everything that's being earned is saved. So that's going in savings. And remaining part must have been paid in the form of taxes. So when we receive income, these are the three things that we do. We either consume that, or we save, or we pay taxes. If you take a total of this, of all the people in that area, automatically you would get total of their income. Are you following this? So this is your GDP from income approach. Now the expenditure perspective. So how do people spend? So again, see the total consumption in the economy, or I, that not necessary that everything is a operating or everything is a consumption. Maybe some part of the consumption is in the form of investments. Okay, so I shouldn't use the word consumption, but some of the goods and services are being used from an investment perspective. For example, let us say a large company spending resources on construction of a new building. Can that be considered as an investment? A company putting in more money into its inventory, that's again an investment. So all the private business investment, that is I, plus maybe some part of the goods are being used by the government. So government is building new roads, they're building new gardens, they are consuming resources for themselves. So that is G. And some part of the goods are not consumed in India, maybe they are being sent outside. So that is net exports. Alright, so again think of it this way. I told you that in India, let's say 100 was the value of total income earned by the people. That means value of goods and services produced was how much? 100. So imagine now, just think of this as goods worth 100 with us. Now what happens to those goods? So think of them as some sort of a raw material. Okay, let's say just cement, nothing else. So what happens with that? Some part of that is domestically consumed. Okay, some part of that is used by businesses to invest. Some part of that is used by the government, and then some part of that is exported. So if you take a total of this, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, you get the expenditure approach. If you take a total of this, you get the income approach. Logically, C plus I plus G plus X minus M should be equal to C plus S plus T. So you go the income route or you go to the expenditure route, the total of GDPs has to be same with each other. Are we okay here? So write down the equation. Say GDP with income approach, GDP with income approach, C plus S plus T, consumption plus saving plus taxes. And GDP using expenditure approach is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Consumption, investments, government spending, net exports. X for exports, M for imports. Okay, now this is just an equation, but this equation has really large size effects on how economy behaves. For example, now typically for developing countries, C is considered a very large part of the overall economy. So the largest component of GDP typically comes from C, generally, or the most stable component of GDP comes from C, okay, which is your household consumption. So what economists do is they take C as a ratio to overall GDP of different countries, and they try to observe that how much is the household consumption contributing towards GDP of a country. Then they take I as a function of overall GDP. Now generally investments are function of business sentiment. Are you following this? So when the economic sentiment is not good, automatically you would expect I part of the GDP to come down. But when the sentiments are good, I part goes up, but C part more or less remains stable. And therefore those economies where C component is substantially larger, generally GDP is considered more stable. Are you following what I'm trying to say? Then the reason why whenever government decides that it is going to spend more, and these are the reason why budgets are so important. When the government plans that this is the amount I'm going to spend on these activities this year. So this year in our Indian Union budget, they decided to have slightly larger output on or larger spending on infrastructure sector. So when that happens and when G component increases, economists understand that because of the increase in G, the overall economy can increase. Following this? Now, exports make sense because some of our goods have gone out. Why should we reduce the imports? So imagine consumption this year was 30. Okay, imagine, let me make this 60. Imagine investments were 10. G was, let us say 25. Okay, and this is 70, 95, and exports were 10. Exports were 10. But then the question is that this is totaling to 10. Is it totaling to 105? 105. But then we produced only 100. So where did those extra 5 goods come from? Those 5 goods were imported. So maybe out of the 60, 55 were domestically produced and 5 were imported. But those imported goods are not what we have produced within India. So they shouldn't be a part of our GDP. So we say -5 here. So we just take the net export number. Are we okay with this? Okay. Now this is our next sentence. This also goes into your notes. Now see, this is very interesting. One of the criteria for a good or service to be included in the GDP is that it has to be something that is sold. Now think of some highly valuable services which are not sold but which are of high value items. Let's say number one, the services provided by let's say a homemaker, either of the spouse. Okay, so services like cooking or childcare. So these services, are these sold? That's a fascinating idea though. But they are not sold, and the fact that they are not sold, they are not included in the GDP. And then think of those countries where men and women both work. I mean, countries where the percentage of men and women both working is substantially higher, versus countries where, a lot of countries where women do not work, a lot of countries where men do not work. There are countries like these. So then in those countries where especially either of men or women who are not working and just providing household services, automatically their GDP will go down vis-a-vis those countries where both of them are working, because then in that case they will end up buying those services. Are you following what I'm trying to say? So another example could be, imagine illegal activities. So illegal activities, the goods are sold, but they are not officially sold, so they do not get captured into GDP. The best example here, think of Mexico. Okay, so compared to what is being, by the way, has anyone seen Pablo Escobar? Yeah, Narcos is. So you can watch it maybe after your level 1 exams. So imagine the size and volume of the drugs market in some of the Latin American countries. Correct? But since it is not reported because it's illegal, it will never be a part of GDP. If you include those activities and add to GDP, maybe Mexico will, fare substantially higher than where it is right now. Okay, as in Mexico is just an example, other South American countries. Are we okay with this? Now there are two exceptions, that there are two services which are not sold but included in the GDP. So write down two exceptions and give them a 3-star. They're important from exam perspective. So the logic for owner occupied housing is like this. Imagine two countries, let's say some country in Europe and let's say some country in India, some city in India, just covering myself. Now in a lot of countries in Europe, the preference is not to buy a house. They do not assign so much of emotional importance to owning a house of your own. But in India or a lot of other Asian countries, we have an emotional investment or emotional attachment to buying a residential property. So imagine now there is one property that this person has. So this, let's call him A, and there is one apartment that he has rented. Okay, and the fact that he has rented the apartment, okay, whatever is the monthly rent, that gets captured into a part of the GDP of the country. Are we okay with this? Now imagine this person B, now he is the owner of the house. Now fact that he is the owner of the house, will he be paying any rent? No. And then if he does not pay any rent, in a way the opportunity cost of that property will never get captured into the GDP of the country. Are you following this? So what governments do in that case, they estimate a rent. Okay, it's a very complicated procedure, but just know that they figure out some way of estimating a rent, and that estimated rent goes into GDP of the country. And that is why it is said as owner occupied housing is one of those services which are not sold, but they are still included in the part of the GDP. Second example, imagine, what is this? Wow, I love you guys today. Thank you. Yeah, this is a traffic signal. And who is this? Mama. Yeah, this is a cop on the signal. And is he providing you services by managing traffic? And is that service valuable? Yes, it is a valuable service. Now, does he sell you those services officially? No. So those services are not sold. But then, even though those services, and imagine all governments, departments, in a way they are service providers, correct? Because we pay them taxes, and then in return we get services, but that's not legally a sale transaction, but those services are valuable. So again, these services at cost are considered as a part of GDP. Okay, so how do you know what is the cost of the service? Simply salary of government employees. Salary of government employees, that is added to the part of GDP. Okay, these are the two exceptions. Write this down quickly. Or I think do you want to write this? Okay, write fast. Okay, the question he asked, when someone buys an apartment, then that goes as a part of the GDP. So why do we have to estimate the rent again? So imagine even in, let's say in this European example, that builder sold that flat to some person C, and C sold that flat to some person A, and then C sold that to some person D, and then A rented. Will the value of the property get captured in the GDP? And will the rent again be captured? So it's like this, that when you have a capital asset, that capital asset one has a price at which it gets created, but that capital asset generates some revenue every year, correct? So that capital asset has to be a part of GDP, which means that when B buys the property, that has to be a part of GDP. When that builder constructs that property, that has to be a part of GDP. Once that capital asset is taken, the operating revenue from the capital asset should also be a part of GDP. It has to be both ways. So these were the two exceptions, and I hope you would remember this for the exams. Let me just make sure I've covered everything for you. Okay, then write down one more sentence. GDP includes purchases of newly produced goods and services, in bracket, to avoid double counting.